The police cruiser didn't slow down. It didn't hesitate. It mounted the curb and stopped inches from the woman's folding table, the front bumper kissing the cracked concrete like a threat that had learned how to breathe. People froze. A grocery bag split open. Apples rolled. Someone gasped. And behind that table stood Ruth Caldwell, 73 years old, spine curved from decades of work hands wrapped around a stack of receipts that shook harder than she would ever admit. "Step away from the table, ma'am." The officer's voice was flat. Not cruel. Worse. Official. Ruth didn't move. She looked at the badge, then the cruiser, then the thin yellow notice already taped crookedly to the light pole behind her. Code violation. Unauthorized use of public space. Immediate compliance required. Immediate. As if her life could be folded up and carried away in one word. The wind pushed at the edges of the paper flyers on her table. Church rummage sale. Free blood pressure checks on Sunday. Lost cat. The corner of one flyer lifted and slapped back down again. Tap, tap, like a nervous heartbeat. Ruth swallowed. Her voice when it came was steady. Too steady for someone being erased in public. "I have a permit." The officer didn't look at her. He looked past her at the man leaning against the pharmacy window across the street. Frank Doyle, hands in pockets, coffee cup untouched, watching. The officer exhaled through his nose. "That permit expired." "It didn't," Ruth said. "I renewed it in March." "March of last year," the officer replied. "It's April now." A lie. Clean. Polite. Delivered like a fact. Ruth felt heat rise behind her eyes but didn't let it spill. She had learned long ago that crying only made men like Frank more comfortable. Around them, the sidewalk filled with a low electric hum. Phones lifted. A woman whispered, "What did she do?" Someone else muttered, "Probably zoning. Probably." That word had chased Ruth her entire life. Probably difficult. Probably behind. Probably didn't keep up. Probably alone. The officer reached for the edge of the table. That was when Ruth finally moved. She placed one hand flat on the wood. Her fingers were swollen, the knuckles thick and ridged like old roots breaking through pavement. The table didn't move. "You touch this," she said quiet now, "and you touch me." The officer paused. Just a fraction. Long enough for doubt to flicker and die. "Ma'am, don't make this harder than it needs to be." Harder. Ruth almost laughed. Hard was losing her husband to a refinery accident that came with apologies and no compensation. Hard was raising a son on graveyard shifts and canned soup. Hard was watching that son walk out one winter with a borrowed coat and a promise to call. Hard was silence. This was theft with a smile. Frank pushed himself off the window and crossed the street slowly like he owned the pavement. His shoes were too clean for a man who claimed to represent local concerns. He stopped beside the officer, nodded once, friendly. "Ruth," he said as if greeting an old friend. "We talked about this." She didn't look at him. If she did, she might say something that would cost her the last thing she had left. "You told me not to draw attention," Frank continued. "And now look." His eyes slid to the small crowd, the phones, the murmurs. "You don't want trouble," he added softly, "at your age." There it was, the sentence men used when they thought time itself was a weapon. Ruth finally met his gaze. Up close, Frank smelled like expensive cologne and stale arrogance. His smile was careful, calculated. He looked pleased the way people do when a plan works without effort. "You said you'd handle the paperwork," Ruth said. "You said if I paid, everything would stay clean." Frank sighed, the sound of a man burdened by someone else's incompetence. "I helped where I could. But rules change. You know that." The officer cleared his throat. "Ma'am, last warning." Ruth closed her eyes for half a second. Behind her lids, memory surged. Not soft. Sharp. The first time she set up this table years ago, it was raining. She had stood here with a thermos of coffee and a cardboard sign that said, "Community Outreach," written in blue marker by a church volunteer who never came back. People had laughed then, crossed the street, told her to get a real job. She had stayed. She always stayed. Ruth opened her eyes. "Frank," she said, and her voice carried farther than she intended. "You don't get to decide when I disappear." The crowd hushed. Frank's smile tightened. "I'm trying to protect you." "No," Ruth said. "You're trying to own me." A murmur rippled. Frank's jaw flexed. He hadn't expected resistance. Not today. Not with witnesses. The officer shifted his weight uneasy now. "Sir," he said quietly, "do you want me to proceed?" Frank hesitated. Just long enough. Ruth saw it. The calculation. The split second where control wavered. And in that moment, something inside her settled. She reached into the canvas bag at her feet and pulled out a thin manila envelope. Old. Creased. Not impressive to look at. She held it up. "This," she said, "is my permit. And my renewal. And the receipts for every payment I've made in the last 8 years. Cash. Check. Online transfers. Dates. Amounts." Frank's eyes flicked to the envelope despite himself. "And this," Ruth continued, turning slightly so the crowd could hear, "is a copy of my complaint. Filed yesterday. State level." The officer's head snapped up. "State." Ruth nodded. "Consumer Protection, Elder Abuse Division." The word abuse landed hard. Phones lifted higher. Frank laughed sharp and brittle. "Don't be dramatic." "I buried a husband and lost a son without drama," Ruth said. "This is paperwork." Silence stretched. The officer took a step back, uncertainty creeping into his posture. "Ma'am," he said, more cautious now, "who advised you to file that?" Ruth looked past him, past Frank. Down the street, where the morning traffic crawled and the city pretended not to notice what it crushed. Someone had advised her. Yes. Someone who had walked into her life weeks ago under a name she didn't recognize, with questions that cut too close to the bone. Someone who had listened instead of interrupting. Someone who had looked at Frank's operation and gone very still. But Ruth said nothing. Not yet. She lowered the envelope and rested it against her chest, right over her heart. It beat fast, stronger than she felt. "I'm not moving," she said. The officer hesitated. Then reluctantly, he reached for his radio. Frank took a step back, and for the first time in a very long while, Ruth Caldwell stood on a public sidewalk, underestimated, trembling, and unafraid. The story had already started. The radio crackled, then went silent, and that silence told Ruth more than words ever could. Frank Doyle stopped smiling. He masked it quickly, but Ruth caught the microsecond when his confidence slipped the way a man flinches before he realizes he's being watched. He adjusted his jacket, squared his shoulders, and leaned toward the officer as if this were still his sidewalk, his rules. "Let's not waste everyone's morning," Frank said, voice smooth rehearsed. "This woman is confused. Happens. Age does that." Ruth didn't respond. She focused on her breathing. In through the nose, out through the mouth. She had learned that trick when her hands shook too badly to hold a ladle. The officer glanced between them, fingers hovering over the radio again. "Sir," he said, more careful now, "I need to confirm." She said, "State level." Frank waved a dismissive hand. "Anybody can file anything online. Doesn't make it real." "It does, when it comes with documentation," Ruth said quietly. Frank turned to her, irritation leaking through the polish. "You think some paperwork scares me?" "No," Ruth replied. "I think witnesses do." The crowd had grown. Not large, but enough. A man in a veteran's cap stood with his arms crossed, jaw tight. A woman with a stroller had stopped pretending to check her phone. Someone across the street had started recording horizontally, now no longer hiding it. Frank noticed. He always noticed when eyes turned against him. "This is harassment," he snapped, turning to the officer. "You're letting her turn this into a spectacle." The officer hesitated, then spoke into the radio again. His tone was different now. Measured. Procedural. He was buying time. Ruth felt it then. A shift. Not victory, but traction. Behind her the light changed. Cars rolled. Life tried to move on. And then a voice cut through the noise. "Mrs. Caldwell." Ruth turned. A man stood just beyond the crowd, tall, mid-40s, wearing a navy jacket that didn't scream money but whispered it. No logo. No flash. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were alert, scanning everything at once. He held a paper coffee cup untouched. "Yes," Ruth said. He stepped closer, stopping a respectful distance away. "I'm Daniel Harper. We spoke last week." Frank stiffened. Ruth nodded once. "We did." Daniel's gaze flicked briefly to Frank, then back to Ruth. "I told you not to stand alone if this happened." "I'm not alone," Ruth said. "I'm standing." Something like approval crossed Daniel's face. The officer looked relieved. "Sir, are you with her?" Daniel smiled politely. "I'm with the truth." Frank scoffed. "And who exactly are you supposed to be?" Daniel turned fully now, meeting Frank's eyes without hostility, without warmth. "Someone who asks questions when elderly citizens pay recurring fees without receipts." Frank's face flushed. "You accusing me of something?" Daniel took a slow sip of his coffee, grimaced at the cold, and tossed the cup into a nearby trash can. Not yet. That word again. Not yet. Frank laughed too loudly. "This is ridiculous. You can't just show up. And—" "Actually," Daniel interrupted. "Calm. I can." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded badge holder, flipping it open just long enough for the officer to see. The officer's posture changed instantly. Spine straight, eyes sharp. "Yes, sir," he said. Frank took a step back. "Hold on. That's not Daniel. Close the badge. We'll keep this informal for now." "For now." Ruth felt her knees weaken just a little. She steadied herself against the table. Daniel noticed. He shifted closer without touching her, a silent support. Mrs. Caldwell filed a complaint. Daniel continued, voice carrying but controlled. "Multiple, actually. Patterned payments, coercive language, threats of enforcement without citation." Frank's mouth opened. Closed. "This is a misunderstanding." "Then it should be easy to clear up," Daniel said. "Right here, right now." The officer looked between them. "Sir, I'll need direction." Daniel nodded. "No removal, no seizure. You can step back." The officer complied immediately. Frank's eyes darted. "Calculating exits." "You're overstepping," he said lower now. "This is local." Daniel smiled faintly. "That's usually where the rot starts." Ruth watched Frank closely. She had known men like him her whole life, men who thrived in the gaps between rules, men who mistook patience for weakness. Frank leaned in, voice dropping. "You think you're saving her? You don't know what you're stepping into." Daniel leaned in too, matching the distance. "I do." Their eyes locked. For a moment, Ruth feared this would escalate into something uglier. But Daniel stepped back, hands open. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, turning to her, "I need you to do something for me. Ruth lifted her chin. Tell me. Go home, he said. For today. The words hit harder than she expected. I can't, Ruth replied. If I leave, he wins. Daniel shook his head. No. If you stay, he shifts the narrative. He wants a scene. He wants you framed as defiant. Ruth looked at her table. The flyers, the receipts, her life in portable form. I've already lost enough ground, she said. Daniel's voice softened, but didn't weaken. You're not retreating. You're repositioning. Frank laughed again, trying to regain footing. See, even your hero wants you gone. Daniel didn't look at him. Frank, go home. Excuse me, you've pushed as far as you can today, Daniel said. Any further and this stops being uncomfortable and starts being public. Frank bristled. You don't scare me. Daniel finally looked at him. You wouldn't be talking if I didn't. Silence pressed in. Frank's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced down, then away, jaw tight. Fine, he muttered. We'll continue this later. Ruth watched him retreat. His shoulders tense, steps too quick for a man pretending not to care. When he disappeared down the block, the crowd slowly dispersed, disappointment evident. No explosion, no spectacle. Just the quiet unraveling of control. Ruth exhaled, realizing she'd been holding her breath. Daniel turned back to her. You okay? She nodded, though her hands still shook. I didn't think anyone would come. Daniel studied her face. They don't usually. That's why people like him get comfortable. The officer cleared his throat. Sir, do you need anything else? Daniel shook his head. Not from you. The officer nodded and walked away. Relief in every step. Ruth sat down heavily on her folding chair. Her legs felt boneless. Daniel crouched slightly to meet her eye level. You did the hardest part, he said. You spoke. Ruth looked at him. Why are you really here? Daniel paused. Because he said slowly, you're not the only one he's been doing this to. Ruth's heart skipped. Others? Daniel nodded. Vendors, seniors, people without lawyers. You were just the first to keep records. Ruth let out a humorless breath. Figures. Daniel stood. Go home. Lock your door. Don't answer if anyone knocks tonight. And tomorrow? Ruth asked. Daniel's expression shifted, something steel-hard, settling behind his eyes. Tomorrow we open the file. Ruth watched him walk away, disappearing into the same city that had ignored her for years. She packed up her table slowly, deliberately, every motion an act of defiance. As she folded the last flyer, a thought surfaced, unbidden and sharp. If this was only the beginning, then Frank Doyle had no idea what kind of woman he had tried to erase. Ruth slept in fragments that night, the kind of sleep that never fully takes hold. Every sound outside her apartment pulled her back to the surface. A car door, footsteps on gravel, someone laughing too loud 2 floors down. She lay still on her narrow bed, eyes open in the dark, one hand resting on the envelope Daniel had told her to keep close. It felt heavier now, as if paper could gain weight when truth pressed against it. At 3 a.m, her phone buzzed. She didn't answer it. It buzzed again, then stopped. Ruth waited another full minute before reaching over and checking the screen. Unknown number. No message. Her chest tightened. Frank had always liked to let silence do the work. She sat up slowly and swung her feet to the floor. The apartment smelled like old wood and dish soap. Familiar. Safe in its own tired way. She went to the window and pushed the curtain aside just enough to look out. Nothing. The streetlight hummed. A stray cat crossed the road and vanished between parked cars. Normal. Too normal. Ruth closed the curtain and leaned her forehead against the cool glass. Daniel's voice echoed in her mind. Go home. Lock your door. Don't answer. She locked it again, even though it already was. Morning came without relief. Gray light seeped through the blinds. Ruth brewed coffee she barely tasted and sat at her small kitchen table, hands folded around the mug. She didn't turn on the radio. She didn't want noise. Noise made room for doubt. At 8, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text. We need to talk. Today. For your own good. No name, no number. Ruth deleted it. By 9, there was a knock. Not loud, not urgent, polite. Ruth froze. The knock came again. Same rhythm. Controlled. She moved to the door, heart hammering, and looked through the peephole. A woman stood outside. Mid-30s, hair pulled back, neutral jacket. Clipboard tucked under her arm. She smiled, the practiced smile of someone trained to put others at ease. Mrs. Caldwell, the woman called softly, City Services. Ruth didn't open the door. What department, she asked through the wood. Community Compliance, the woman replied. We just have a few questions. Ruth's jaw tightened. Community Compliance. A new name for an old pressure. I've already spoken to the state, Ruth said. The woman's smile faltered just slightly. This won't take long. Ruth stepped back from the door, then put it in writing. Silence. Then, we can come back later. Do that, Ruth said. With a warrant. The footsteps retreated. Ruth waited until she heard the stairwell door close before she let herself breathe. Her phone rang at 10. This time the name was there. Daniel Harper. She answered immediately. They came, Ruth said before he could speak. I know, Daniel replied. His voice was calm, but there was an edge beneath it now. They're testing you. They're testing how scared I am, Ruth said. Yes, Daniel agreed. And how alone. Ruth looked around her apartment. The cracked linoleum, the single chair, the framed photo of her husband taken before the accident when his eyes still laughed. I've been alone a long time. Daniel paused. You're not now. There was movement on his end. Papers, voices distant. I need you to stay put today. Don't go to the cart. Ruth's hand tightened around the phone. That cart is my life. And that's why they'll use it, Daniel said. Frank is already shifting the story. He's telling people you're under investigation. Ruth closed her eyes. For what fraud, Daniel said. Unlicensed activity. Exploitation. Ruth laughed once sharp and bitter. Exploitation. Of who myself doesn't matter, Daniel replied. It just has to sound plausible. A knock echoed in the background of his call. Daniel cursed quietly. They're leaning on others, he continued. Vendors, landlords, anyone who might distance themselves from you. Ruth swallowed. He's poisoning the ground. Yes, Daniel said, which means he's scared. There was something reassuring in that. Ruth held on to it. What do I do? She asked. For now, Daniel said, nothing. That's the hardest part. The call ended, leaving the apartment too quiet again. Ruth spent the afternoon pacing. She cleaned what was already clean. Folded laundry she had folded the night before. She caught herself checking the clock every few minutes, waiting for a day that refused to move. At 4, she heard raised voices outside. She went to the window again. Across the street, Frank stood with 2 men she didn't recognize. One wore a city vest, the other held a phone to his ear. Frank gestured animatedly toward Ruth's building, his movements sharp, impatient. Even from this distance, Ruth recognized the posture. Commanding, certain. She stepped back from the window as if it could see her. Her phone buzzed again. A message from a neighbor she barely knew. Heard city might shut you down. Hope it's not true. Another buzz. Frank says there's trouble. Be careful. Ruth sank into her chair, the weight finally pressing down. This was how it worked. Not one blow, 1,000 small cuts. The sun dipped lower. Shadows stretched across her living room like fingers. At 6, there was another knock. This one was different. Firmer, less polite. Ruth didn't move. Mrs. Caldwell, a man's voice called, "Open the door!" She stayed seated, heart pounding. "Ma'am, if you don't open, we'll have to return with enforcement." Ruth stood slowly, every joint protesting. She walked to the door and placed her hand on it, feeling the vibration of her own pulse through the wood. "I want identification," she said. A pause. Then a card slid under the door. Ruth bent and picked it up. Municipal Code Enforcement. A name she didn't recognize. She straightened shoulders back. "I've contacted the state," she said. "Any further communication goes through them." Silence stretched. Then footsteps retreated. Ruth slid down the door and sat on the floor, breath coming in shallow pulls. This was war, she realized. Not loud, not bloody, but relentless. Her phone rang again. Daniel. "They pushed," she said before he could ask. "They always do on day 2, he replied. "You held." "How long does this last?" Ruth asked. Daniel didn't answer immediately. "Until someone breaks," he said finally. "Or until someone higher decides to look." Ruth closed her eyes. And who breaks first? Daniel's voice was steady. "Not you." Outside, the streetlights flickered on. Inside, Ruth Caldwell sat on her floor, tired to her bones, frightened and still standing. She didn't know it yet, but by refusing to disappear quietly, she had already crossed a line Frank Doyle could never step back over. By the 3rd morning, the neighborhood no longer felt like a place Ruth lived. It felt like a room she was being questioned in. She stepped outside just after sunrise, the air still cool, carrying the metallic smell of last night's rain. Her cart sat where she had left it folded and chained harmless. Yet the sidewalk around it looked disturbed, as if something had paced there in the dark. A paper cup lay on its side. A flyer had been torn halfway down and left dangling like a warning. Ruth bent slowly and picked it up. Someone had written across it in red marker. Fraud. The word bled through the paper. She straightened, spine aching, and looked around. Windows watched her without faces. Curtains twitched, then settled. The city woke up pretending nothing was wrong. Ruth unlocked the chain and began to set up anyway. Table first. Cloth. The weight of habit guided her hands. Each movement felt deliberate, defiant. She wasn't supposed to be here today. Everyone knew that, which was exactly why she was. A pickup truck slowed as it passed. The driver leaned out. "You should go home," he said, not unkindly. "They're saying things." Ruth nodded once. They always do. By 8, 2 other vendors had set up across the street. Neither looked at her. One packed up and left before 10. At 10:15, Frank Doyle arrived. He didn't cross the street this time. He stayed on the opposite curb, hands clasped behind his back, surveying her like a piece of property he hadn't decided what to do with yet. He wore a different jacket. New. Crisp. He wanted to look legitimate. Ruth felt him before she saw him. The air tightened. He called out, voice carrying just enough to draw attention. "Ruth, you really should stop." She didn't answer. Frank smiled slow. "This isn't good for your health." Ruth ladled soup into a cup, hands steady. "Neither is extortion." A few heads turned. Frank's smile slipped. "Careful," he said. "People don't like accusations." "They don't like bullies either," Ruth replied. Frank took a step closer to the curb. "I'm trying to protect you." "You keep saying that," Ruth said. "Funny thing is, Everything you do feels like harm. Murmurs rippled. Someone whispered Frank's name. He noticed. His jaw tightened. That complaint you filed, he said, lowering his voice. It won't go anywhere. Ruth looked at him. You sound worried. Frank laughed. Too fast. I'm realistic. A city sedan rolled up behind him. 2 people got out. One wore a blazer, the other carried a tablet. Ruth's heart thudded. Frank turned, welcoming them with open arms. There she is, he said, pointing. The situation. The woman with the tablet approached. She looked young, efficient, tired. Mrs. Caldwell, she said, we need to ask you some questions. Ruth wiped her hands on a towel. Am I being cited? Not yet, the woman said. Then I'm busy, Ruth replied. Frank scoffed. See what I mean? The man in the blazer stepped forward. Ma'am, refusal to cooperate can be interpreted as intimidation, a voice cut in. Daniel Harper stepped out from between 2 parked cars. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't rushed. But the street shifted around him like it recognized authority before it understood why. Frank turned, face hardening. You again. Daniel smiled faintly. You look tired. The woman with the tablet frowned. Sir, this is an active municipal inquiry. Daniel nodded. Which is why I'm here. He produced a folder and handed it to her. State oversight. You'll want to read page 3. She hesitated, then took it. Her eyes scanned. Her posture changed. The man in the blazer leaned over her shoulder. His expression tightened. Frank's smile vanished. This is harassment, he snapped. You're ambushing city employees. Daniel didn't look at him. Frank stepped back. You don't give me orders? No, Daniel agreed. The law does. The woman cleared her throat. We weren't informed of any state involvement. Daniel's gaze stayed calm. That's being addressed. Frank laughed sharp. You think you can scare people with paper? Daniel finally turned to him. I think you've been scaring people with threats. Silence fell heavy. A woman near the bus stop raised her phone higher. A man shook his head slowly, as if a puzzle piece had clicked into place. Ruth watched Frank carefully. She saw it then. The crack. The fear slipping through his control. He lunged verbally. You want the truth? She's been paying because she knows she's out of compliance. Ruth felt the lie hit like a slap. Daniel didn't flinch. Prove it. Frank spread his hands. Permits. Zoning. Cash transactions. Daniel nodded. We have 8 years of payments. No receipts. No citations. No formal warnings. Just you. The man in the blazer swallowed. The woman with the tablet stepped back. Frank, we need clarification. Frank snapped his head toward her. I don't answer to you. That was the mistake. Daniel's voice dropped quiet and lethal. Actually, you do. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance. Not close. Not yet. Ruth felt her legs tremble. She leaned against the table, breathing through it. This was bigger than her now, bigger than soup and sidewalks. Frank looked around, realizing too late that the crowd wasn't on his side, that it never had been. It had just been afraid. You think this ends well? He hissed at Daniel. You think she walks away clean? Daniel's eyes flicked to Ruth. Something unreadable passed through them. No, he said. I think this ends honestly. The woman with the tablet tapped her screen. We're suspending this inquiry pending review. Frank's mouth opened. Closed. You can't do that, he said. She met his eyes. I just did. Frank's face flushed purple. He stepped toward Ruth, pointing. You think you've won? Ruth met his gaze. Her voice was quiet, but it carried. No. I think I've stopped losing. The sirens grew louder. Frank took a step back, then another. Daniel watched him retreat, expression unreadable. Ruth sank into her chair, exhaustion crashing over her like a wave. Daniel moved closer, speaking low. "You did good." Ruth looked up at him. "You're not telling me everything." Daniel didn't deny it. Not yet. Ruth nodded. She understood secrets. They had weight. As the city officials packed up and left, the crowd slowly dispersed, buzzing with a new energy. The word fraud was already being replaced with another. Extortion. Abuse. Truth. Ruth stared at her hands. They were still shaking. Daniel leaned in. "This is the part where it gets dangerous." Ruth smiled faintly. It already was. Daniel straightened eyes, scanning the street. "Go home early today." Ruth nodded. "I will." But as she packed up her cart, a strange certainty settled in her chest. Frank Doyle wasn't done, and neither was she. The envelope disappeared from Ruth's mailbox overnight. She knew because she checked it every morning out of habit, fingers brushing the rusted edge as if it were a pulse point. Yesterday it had been there thick with copies Daniel had insisted she keep outside the apartment. Today, the slot yawned empty. Ruth stood very still in the hallway, the smell of old carpet and boiled cabbage hanging in the air. Her heart did not race. It slowed. That was worse. It meant the fear had passed into something colder. "He's escalating," she thought. She locked her door twice, then a third time, and leaned her forehead against the wood. The building was waking up. Pipes knocked. Someone upstairs dragged a chair across the floor. Normal sounds pretending the ground wasn't shifting. Her phone rang at 7:20. "Daniel." "They took it," Ruth said before he could speak. A pause. Paper rustled on his end. "Which envelope?" "The mailbox copy." Another pause, shorter this time. "Controlled." "Did you touch it this morning?" "No." "Good," Daniel said. "That means it's evidence now." Ruth closed her eyes. So he broke in. "Yes," Daniel replied. "Or sent someone who did." Ruth let out a dry breath. "I knew he wouldn't stop. He won't." Daniel agreed. "Not on his own." She waited. Daniel didn't rush. He knew when silence was needed. "What happens next?" Ruth asked. Daniel lowered his voice. "Now he makes it personal." Ruth opened her eyes and looked down the dim hallway, half expecting to see Frank standing there, hands in pockets, smiling. "He already has." "No," Daniel said. "He's been operating in the margins. Today he steps into the light." Ruth didn't like the sound of that. By 9, the rumors had found her. She didn't need social media to know. The looks were enough. A neighbor she'd nodded to for years avoided her gaze. Another watched her door too closely, curiosity mixed with suspicion. At 10, a folded notice appeared taped to the building entrance. Official notice. Large letters. Bold. Designed to scare before it explained. Ruth read it twice. Emergency inspection scheduled. Property access required. Her landlord's name sat at the bottom. A man who never fixed anything unless forced. Daniel arrived just before noon. He didn't knock. He called her phone from the hallway. "It's me." Ruth opened the door and let him in quickly, then locked it behind him. Daniel scanned the apartment with professional calm. Windows, corners, doorframe. "They're squeezing your landlord," he said, "trying to force an inspection." "He'll fold," Ruth said. "Yes," Daniel replied. "That's why we're here." Ruth caught it. She studied him more closely now. The cut of his jacket. The way he stood relaxed, but ready like someone who had spent years preparing for moments like this. "You keep saying we," she said. "You're not telling me everything." Daniel met her gaze. "Not yet." Ruth nodded. She had lived long enough to recognize a man carrying weight. "Then tell me this. Why me?" Daniel exhaled slowly. Because you didn't break. That afternoon, the inspectors came. Not one, 3. They filled the narrow hallway with their presence clipboards out voices loud enough to travel through doors. One of them knocked on Ruth's door with authority, the kind meant to remind you who paid the badge. Daniel opened it. "Yes," he said pleasantly. The lead inspector frowned. "We're here for an emergency compliance check." Daniel nodded. "I'll need to see the order." The inspector bristled. "Sir, step aside." Daniel didn't move. "Order first." A second inspector leaned in. "You obstructing an inspection?" Daniel smiled. "I'm ensuring due process." The third inspector shifted uneasy. Frank said Daniel's eyes flicked to him. "Sharp. Frank isn't your supervisor." Silence fell. Ruth watched from behind Daniel, her heart pounding, every instinct screaming at her to hide. Instead, she straightened her shoulders. The lead inspector cleared his throat. "Ma'am, are you refusing access?" Ruth stepped forward. Her voice surprised even her. "Calm. Clear. I'm requesting documentation." The inspector's jaw tightened. "This isn't optional." Daniel spoke softly. "Actually, it is." He reached into his jacket and produced another badge, this one unmistakable. State Seal. Oversight Division. The hallway seemed to shrink. The inspectors froze. "I suggest you leave," Daniel continued, "before this becomes a problem for you personally." The lead inspector swallowed. "We were told this was routine." Daniel tilted his head. "By who?" No one answered. They backed away, the authority draining from their steps, and disappeared down the stairwell. Ruth sagged against the wall, breath coming fast. "That was close." Daniel shook his head. "That was sloppy." Ruth looked at him sharply. "Sloppy how?" "He's rushing," Daniel said. "Which means something changed." Ruth's phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "You could have walked away. Now you've made enemies." Ruth showed it to Daniel. Daniel's jaw tightened. "He's panicking." "Panicking people get dangerous," Ruth said. "Yes," Daniel agreed. "Which is why we stop this now." He looked at her, measuring something. Then he made a decision. "I need to tell you who I am," he said. Ruth felt her pulse in her ears. "I've been waiting." Daniel took a breath. "I'm not just state oversight." He reached into his bag and pulled out a thin folder. Inside were photos, documents, old headlines. Ruth's eyes widened. Frank Doyle. Younger. Standing beside men in suits. Fundraisers. Smiling. Power. "He's been under quiet investigation for years," Daniel said. Protection rackets. Permit manipulation. Threats. Elder targeting. "Why hasn't anyone stopped him?" Ruth asked. Daniel's voice hardened. "Because he's careful, and because victims disappear quietly." Ruth felt a chill. Disappear. Economically, Daniel clarified. Socially. Sometimes physically. Ruth closed her eyes. She thought of the envelope, the mailbox, the empty slot. "And you?" she asked. Daniel met her gaze. "I'm here because my mother was one of them." The words landed heavy. "She ran a flower stand," Daniel continued. "Paid him every month. One day she couldn't. The stand was gone the next morning. So was she." Ruth's throat tightened. "I'm sorry." Daniel nodded once. "I didn't come here for revenge. I came for proof. He looked at Ruth. "And you gave it to me." Outside, sirens wailed again, closer this time. Daniel straightened. "This ends today." Ruth felt fear coil in her chest, sharp and alive. But beneath it, something else stirred. Resolve. She had been underestimated her whole life. Not today. As footsteps echoed on the stairs, Ruth Caldwell stood in her doorway, an old woman with nothing left to lose and the truth finally watching her back. Frank Doyle didn't come himself. That alone told Daniel everything. The men who showed up instead wore plain jackets and carried nothing in their hands. No clipboards, no badges, no smiles. They stood at the base of Ruth's building like they belonged there, like the street owed them space. Daniel saw them from the window first. Two men. One lean, restless eyes always moving. The other heavier shoulders, squared face unreadable. Not city employees. Not police. "Stay back from the door," Daniel said quietly. Ruth was already standing beside him. "They're not inspectors." "No," Daniel agreed. "They're pressure." The buzzer rang, once, then again. Ruth felt her stomach tighten. She hadn't heard that sound used this way in years. Not asking. Telling. Daniel didn't answer it. The buzzer stopped. Footsteps moved inside the building. Slow, confident. Someone testing how far they could go before being stopped. "They shouldn't be able to come up," Ruth whispered. Daniel's eyes flicked to the stairwell door, visible through the hall mirror. "They can if someone lets them." A knock followed. Not loud, close, too close. "Mrs. Caldwell." A man's voice called through the door, calm, reasonable. "We just want to talk." Ruth's chest burned. The word just had never meant anything good. Daniel leaned in, voice low. "Do not engage." The knock came again, firmer. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," the voice continued. "Frank wants to resolve things." Resolve. Another word that pretended not to carry a threat. Ruth stepped forward despite herself. Daniel put out an arm, stopping her gently. "No," he said. "This is what they want. Fear." The heavier man spoke now. "Mrs. Caldwell, you're a good woman. Everyone knows that. You don't want misunderstandings to spiral." Ruth felt something snap inside her. Years of swallowing. Years of being told to behave, to keep quiet, to be grateful for scraps of safety. She moved Daniel's arm aside and spoke through the door. "I understand plenty," she said. Her voice shook, but it didn't break. "And I'm done talking." Silence pressed against the wood. Then the lean man laughed softly. "You hear that? She's got courage now." Ruth's hands curled into fists. Daniel leaned close to the door. "This conversation is being recorded," he said clearly. "You're trespassing." The laugh stopped. Footsteps shifted. The heavier man cleared his throat. "We'll be downstairs if you change your mind." The retreat was slow, deliberate, meant to linger. Ruth didn't move until she heard the stairwell door slam shut. Her knees gave out then. She sank into the chair by the table, breath coming shallow. Daniel locked the door again, checking the frame, the hinges, the latch. "He sent them to scare you," Ruth said. "Yes," Daniel replied, "and to see if I'd show my hand." Ruth looked up at him. "Did you?" Daniel paused. "Not yet." Outside an engine revved. Tires squealed. The men were gone. For now. An hour later, Daniel's phone rang. He answered without looking at the screen. "Yes," he said. He listened. His expression hardened. When A pause, understood. He ended the call and looked at Ruth. "They're accelerating," he said. "Frank just triggered an emergency hearing." Ruth's heart sank. "Against me." "On paper," Daniel replied. "Against your permit. Against your residence. Against your credibility." Ruth laughed weakly. "He's thorough." "He's desperate," Daniel corrected. Ruth stood slowly. What happens at a hearing like that, Daniel didn't sugarcoat it. They stack the room. Friendly faces. Selective evidence. It's meant to overwhelm. And if I lose Daniel, met her gaze. You won't. Ruth searched his face. You're certain? Daniel hesitated. Just a fraction. I'm prepared, he said instead. That night Ruth barely slept. Every creak sounded like a step. Every shadow felt deliberate. She sat at her kitchen table until dawn, hands wrapped around a mug gone cold, staring at the door. At 7, Daniel drove her to the municipal building. The car was unmarked. Clean. Quiet. Ruth watched the city pass by. Streets she had walked for decades now looked different. Exposed. As if something had peeled back the surface and shown her the machinery underneath. They entered through a side door. Inside the building smelled like disinfectant and old paper. Voices echoed down tiled corridors. Authority lived here, comfortable and unquestioned. The hearing room was already half full. Frank Doyle sat at the front, relaxed, one arm draped over the back of his chair. He wore a dark suit today. He wanted to look legitimate, concerned. When he saw Ruth, his smile returned. There she is, he said loudly. I was worried you wouldn't come. Ruth didn't answer. Daniel guided her to a seat near the aisle. He didn't sit. He stood behind her, hands clasped loosely, eyes scanning the room. People filtered in. A city clerk, a zoning officer, a woman Ruth recognized from a neighborhood committee meeting. None met her eyes. The hearing officer entered and took his seat. A man in his late 50s, hair-thinning expression practiced neutral. Let's begin, he said. Frank stood immediately. Thank you for seeing us on such short notice. He launched into it smoothly. Unauthorized activity, community complaints, elderly woman possibly being misled, safety concerns. He spoke as if Ruth weren't there, as if she were a concept. Ruth listened, hands trembling in her lap. When Frank finished, the hearing officer turned to Ruth. Mrs. Caldwell, do you have representation? Daniel stepped forward. Yes, he said. Frank's smile faltered. And you are the hearing officer asked. Daniel reached into his jacket and placed a folder on the desk. My name is Daniel Harper, he said. And before this continues, I need to disclose that this hearing is now under state review. The room shifted. Frank stood abruptly. That's highly irregular. So is extortion, Daniel replied. The hearing officer frowned. Mr. Harper? Daniel opened the folder. We have recorded threats, missing documentation, coordinated harassment, and witnesses. Ruth's breath caught. Frank's face darkened. You're turning this into a circus! No, Daniel said. You did. The hearing officer glanced at the documents, then at Frank. Mr. Doyle, you didn't disclose these prior interactions. Frank's voice rose. Because they're irrelevant. Daniel's voice stayed calm. They're the case. The door at the back of the room opened. 2 people entered. One wore a state badge, the other carried a camera. Frank froze. The hearing officer's eyes widened. What is this? Daniel answered without looking back. Oversight. The state agent stepped forward. This hearing is suspended. Frank's mouth opened. Closed. You can't, he started. The agent cut him off. Mr. Doyle, we need to speak with you. Ruth felt the room tilt. She gripped the edge of her chair. Frank looked around, panic flashing through his control. This is a mistake. Daniel leaned in, voice low. No, he said. This is the end of pretending. As Frank was escorted out, his gaze locked on Ruth's. There was no apology there. Only fury. Ruth watched him go, heart-pounding legs, weak tears threatening. Daniel turned to her. It's not over, he said softly. But it's broken. Ruth nodded slowly. For the first time in days, she felt something loosen in her chest. Fear hadn't left. But it was no longer alone. The city didn't celebrate when Frank Doyle was taken out of the hearing room. It absorbed the moment the way it absorbed everything else, quietly, efficiently, as if nothing unusual had happened. By noon, the hallway had been mopped. By afternoon, another hearing was already underway in the same room. Power never paused. It only shifted. Ruth felt that immediately. The phone calls stopped, but the looks didn't. When she stepped outside the municipal building, a few people stared too long. Others looked away too fast. Vindication was never clean. It left residue. Daniel walked beside her, close but not hovering. He had learned that about her. She didn't need saving. She needed space to stand. "You should stay somewhere else tonight," he said as they reached the car. Ruth shook her head. "If I leave now, it looks like fear." "It looks like caution," Daniel replied. "I've had enough caution for one lifetime," Ruth said. Daniel studied her face, then nodded. "All right, but you won't be alone." She gave him a sideways look. "I thought you said you weren't staying." "I'm not," he said. "Someone else is." That evening, Ruth returned to her apartment as the sun dipped behind the buildings. The street looked the same. Too same. That unnerved her more than chaos would have. A familiar figure waited near her door. Mrs. Alvarez from the second floor. 78. Widowed. Sharp eyes that missed nothing. "You okay?" Mrs. Alvarez asked without preamble. Ruth nodded. "I think so." Mrs. Alvarez sniffed. "I saw them take him out." Ruth paused. "You did?" Mrs. Alvarez leaned closer. Frank always walked like the ground belonged to him. Today he didn't. Ruth let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Mrs. Alvarez straightened. "I'll keep my radio on tonight. You knock if you need anything." "Thank you," Ruth said, meaning it deeply. Inside, the apartment felt different. Smaller. Exposed. Ruth locked the door, then checked it again. She set the envelope on the table, smoothing it flat like it might try to escape. Her phone buzzed. "Daniel." "They're moving him," he said without greeting. "Temporary hold. Financial Crimes Division." "Temporary," Ruth repeated. "Yes," Daniel said. "He'll try to make bail." "Of course he will, which means this isn't the end," Daniel said. "It's the pivot." Ruth sat down heavily. "What does that mean for me?" Daniel hesitated. "It means he may come at you sideways." "How?" "Reputation." Daniel replied. "If he can't discredit the facts, he'll discredit you." Ruth stared at the wall at a small crack that had been there for years. "People already think they know who I am." "Yes," Daniel said. "And now they'll be encouraged to say it out loud." As if summoned by his words, Ruth's phone buzzed again. A notification she didn't recognize. Someone had sent her a link. She opened it. A neighborhood forum. A post already gaining comments. Concerned citizen asks, "Is Ruth Caldwell involved in corruption scandal?" Ruth's chest tightened. The comments followed fast. "Heard she was paying bribes. Why would a state guy show up for her unless there was more to it?" "Old people get confused." Daniel's voice cut in sharply. "Stop reading." Ruth closed the app. Her hands shook. "He's poisoning the water," she said. "Yes," Daniel replied. "Because he still thinks people drink first and ask questions later." Ruth stood and walked to the window. Down below, the streetlights flickered on. A couple passed by laughing. Life stubborn and indifferent. "What do I do?" she asked. Daniel didn't answer immediately. When he did, his tone had shifted, more deliberate. "You tell your story." Ruth turned. "No one listens." "They will if it's framed correctly," Daniel said. "I'm not good with speeches." "You don't need one," Daniel replied. You need witnesses. The next morning, Ruth went back to her cart. Daniel advised against it. So did Mrs. Alvarez. So did a dozen voices in Ruth's head. She went anyway. The sidewalk buzzed the moment she arrived. Not crowded, but alert, curious. Someone had chalked something on the pavement near where her table usually stood. Justice for Ruth. Her throat tightened. She sat up slowly, carefully. She could feel eyes on her, weighing, judging, reassessing. At 9, a man approached her cart. Mid-60s, work boots, hands scarred from labor. "You okay?" he asked gruffly. Ruth nodded. "I'm standing." He snorted. "About time." He ordered soup, paid in cash. Left a larger bill than necessary. By 10, 2 more customers followed. Then 3. Some spoke, some didn't. All paid. Across the street, a woman Ruth had never seen before held up her phone, not secretly, purposefully. "You're not corrupt," the woman said loudly. "My sister paid Frank, too." The sidewalk went quiet. Ruth froze. The woman swallowed. She ran a hot dog stand. "He shut her down anyway." Another voice joined in. "He came after my dad and my uncle. The dam cracked. Stories spilled out, fragmented, angry, long buried." Ruth stood there, heart racing, listening, as if the sidewalk itself had found a voice. Daniel watched from a distance, unseen, his jaw tight. By noon, a local reporter arrived. Not a network name, someone smaller, hungrier. Mrs. Caldwell, the reporter said, recorder in hand. "Can you tell us what happened?" Ruth hesitated. Then she thought of the envelope, the mailbox, the empty slot. She nodded. "I sold soup," she said simply, "and I paid because I was afraid." The reporter waited, didn't interrupt. "I'm not afraid anymore," Ruth continued, "and neither should anyone else be." The words traveled faster than she expected. By afternoon, the forum thread had shifted. The comments changed tone. "I didn't know. This is bigger than her. Why did we let this go on?" That evening, Daniel sat across from Ruth at her kitchen table, papers spread between them. "You did something important today," he said. Ruth rubbed her temples. "I told the truth." Daniel smiled faintly. "Exactly." Her phone buzzed. A new message. Unknown number. "You think this makes you untouchable?" Ruth stared at it. Daniel watched her expression harden. He reached out. "Yes." Daniel leaned forward. "Good." Ruth frowned. "Good." "Yes," he said, "because now he's nervous enough to make mistakes." Ruth looked at the phone, then set it face down. She was tired. Bone-deep tired. But beneath it something unfamiliar stirred. Momentum. Frank Doyle had tried to erase her quietly. Instead, he had given her a voice. And the city, whether it wanted to or not, had started to listen. The first brick shattered Ruth's front window at 2:17 in the morning. Not hard enough to break the frame. Just enough to explode the glass inward, sharp and violent, the sound ripping her out of sleep like a siren inside her skull. She sat up, screaming, before she realized she was screaming, heart slamming against her ribs, breath tearing out of her throat. By the time she reached the window, the street was empty. Glass glittered across the floor like ice. Cold air rushed in, carrying the smell of rain and exhaust. Ruth stood barefoot, shaking, staring down at the sidewalk, as if it might confess. This wasn't a warning anymore. This was punishment. She didn't call the police. She called Daniel. He answered on the second ring. "He broke my window," she said. Her voice sounded distant, like it belonged to someone else. "I know," Daniel replied. That stopped her. "You know?" "Yes," he said. "I'm already outside." Ruth turned slowly. Down on the street, half hidden by the shadow of a maple tree, Daniel stood with his phone to his ear, face turned up toward her window. Two other figures stood with him, both men, both alert, scanning the block with professional stillness. Ruth's knees weakened. She gripped the window frame. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. "Neither should he," Daniel said. "But here we are." Within minutes, uniformed officers arrived. Real ones this time, not borrowed authority, not favors. They taped off the sidewalk, photographed the damage, asked careful questions. Daniel spoke to them quietly, showing credentials Ruth still hadn't fully processed. The tone was different, respectful, immediate. Mrs. Alvarez appeared in her robe, furious, pointing her cane down the street. "I told you people something bad was coming," she snapped at anyone who would listen. By dawn, Ruth's window was boarded up. The sun rose on a changed street. Neighbors whispered openly now. Some avoided her door. Others brought coffee. One man left a note under her mat. "I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner." Ruth sat at her table, hands wrapped around a mug she couldn't lift to her lips, staring at the plywood where her window had been. Daniel sat across from her jacket, still on eyes sharp despite the long night. "This crossed a line," Ruth said. "Yes," Daniel replied. "Which means we're done waiting." "What does that mean?" she asked. Daniel didn't answer right away. He stood and walked to the boarded window, resting his palm against the wood, as if feeling for something beneath it. "It means," he said slowly. Frank stopped believing he could win quietly. Ruth closed her eyes. "I never wanted a war." Daniel turned back to her. "Neither did my mother." The words hung between them heavy. "You said she disappeared," Ruth said. Daniel nodded. "She didn't vanish. She was erased, her stand shut down, her lease terminated, her reputation smeared, friends stopped calling, employers stopped answering. She died 3 years later. Heart failure." Ruth's throat tightened. "I'm so sorry." Daniel's jaw clenched. "So am I." Outside, a news van rolled slowly down the street, then parked at the corner. Ruth noticed. "They're early." "Yes," Daniel said. "And that's not an accident." By 8, the sidewalk in front of Ruth's building had turned into a quiet gathering. Not loud, not chaotic. People stood with purpose. Some held signs. Others just stood, watching. Local business owner targeted. "Stop the shakedowns." Ruth stared, overwhelmed. "I didn't organize this," she said. "I know," Daniel replied. "That's why it matters." A reporter approached her carefully. Microphone, lowered eyes, serious. "Mrs. Caldwell, are you willing to comment on last night's incident?" Ruth hesitated. Daniel leaned in slightly. "Only if you want to." She thought of the brick, the glass, the fear that had tried to reclaim her in the dark. She nodded. "I didn't do anything wrong," Ruth said, voice steady. "And neither did the people who were too scared to speak before me." The clip spread fast. By noon, Frank Doyle's name was trending locally. Not praise. Questions. By afternoon, his attorney released a statement. Baseless allegations. A misunderstanding. A private dispute blown out of proportion. At 4, Daniel's phone rang again. He listened. Once. Twice. Then he smiled. Not warmly. "He's trying to cut a deal," Daniel said. "With who?" Ruth asked. Daniel met her gaze. "With me." Ruth felt a chill. "Why you?" Daniel exhaled. "Because he finally figured out, I'm not just oversight." Ruth stood slowly. "Then who are you?" Daniel didn't answer directly. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone, scrolling, then turning the screen toward her. A headline. National. Federal task force expands investigation into municipal corruption rings. Below it, a photo. Blurred, but recognizable enough. Frank Doyle being escorted into a building she'd never seen. Ruth's breath caught. That's federal! Yes, Daniel said. And it's been building for years. Ruth stared at him. You're not here because of me. Daniel shook his head. I'm here because of people like you. Silence fell between them, thick with understanding. At 6, Frank's bail hearing was denied. At 7, his lawyer stopped returning calls. At 8, someone tried to leak a story painting Ruth as an informant for hire. It collapsed within hours when 3 other victims went on record. By nightfall, Ruth's door was guarded. Not by police, by neighbors. Mrs. Alvarez sat in a folding chair near the stairwell radio, in hand, daring anyone to try again. You go to sleep, she ordered Ruth. I'll wake you if the world ends. Ruth laughed for the first time in days. It came out shaky, but real. Later, lying in bed staring at the ceiling, Ruth felt something strange settle over her. Not relief. Certainty. Frank Doyle had tried to frighten her back into silence. Instead, he had turned her into a symbol, and symbols once lit were hard to extinguish. Down the street, Daniel stood by his car phone pressed to his ear, voice low and controlled. Yes, he said. She's stronger than you think. A pause. No. Daniel continued. We don't pull back now. He looked up at Ruth's darkened window, the plywood stark against the brick. This ends all the way, he said. And for the first time since this began, the city itself seemed to agree. The indictment dropped before sunrise. Ruth didn't hear about it from the news. She heard it from the sudden quiet. No footsteps in the hallway, no murmurs outside her window, no phones buzzing with anonymous messages. The kind of silence that only comes when people are afraid to say the wrong thing too soon. Daniel called at 6:30. They unsealed it, he said. Ruth sat at her kitchen table, fingers wrapped around a mug she hadn't filled. Unsealed what? A federal indictment, Daniel replied. Multiple counts, racketeering, extortion, witness intimidation, conspiracy. Ruth closed her eyes. The words felt unreal, like they belonged to another life. Is he arrested? Daniel exhaled slowly. He surrendered. That surprised her. He didn't run. No, Daniel said. Men like Frank run until they realize there's nowhere left to go. Ruth nodded, absorbing it. Somewhere deep in her chest, a knot loosened. Not relief, something heavier. Final. By 8, the news vans returned. This time they didn't linger at the corner. They came straight to her building. Ruth watched from behind the door as microphones were set up. Cables rolled out, reporters rehearsing questions with the urgency of people who had missed the first wave and refused to miss the second. Daniel arrived 10 minutes later. He didn't come through the front. He came up the back stairs, quiet, controlled the way someone moves when they expect resistance. They want you, he said simply. Ruth stood. Her knees felt weak, but she ignored it. I know. You don't have to speak, Daniel added. Ruth looked at him. If I don't, someone else will speak for me. Daniel studied her face. For a moment, the sharpness in his eyes softened. Then, let's do it properly. They walked out together. The noise hit her first. Shouts. Questions overlapping. Ruth felt the old instinct to shrink, to apologize for taking up space. She didn't. A reporter pushed forward. Mrs. Caldwell, did you know Frank Doyle was running an extortion ring? Ruth held up a hand. The crowd stilled, surprised by the authority in the gesture. I knew I was afraid, she said. I knew I was paying to be left alone. I didn't know how many others were doing the same. Another voice. Did you cooperate with federal investigators? Ruth glanced at Daniel, just for a heartbeat. "I told the truth," she said. "That's not cooperation. That's survival." Cameras clicked. The words traveled. Someone shouted, "Do you feel vindicated?" Ruth paused. The word rolled around her mouth. Vindicated felt too small. "I feel finished with silence," she said. That was the quote that made it everywhere. By noon, the sidewalk was packed. Not with curiosity now, but with intent. People Ruth had never seen stood shoulder to shoulder with those she had known for decades, but never really met. A retired mechanic. A woman who ran a daycare out of her basement. A man who sold newspapers near the train station. They weren't chanting. They didn't need to. Their presence said enough. Daniel stood slightly behind Ruth, letting her fill the frame. He watched the perimeter eyes tracking movement the way he always did. At one point, a young reporter broke from the pack and approached him. "Sir, can you comment on your role in this investigation?" Daniel shook his head. "Today isn't about me, but you're clearly central," the reporter pressed. Daniel met his gaze. Calm, unyielding. Not yet. By mid-afternoon, Ruth's phone buzzed with a number she didn't recognize. She answered. A man's voice, tight and formal. "Mrs. Caldwell, this is the U.S. Attorney's Office. We'd like to ask if you're willing to make a statement on record." Ruth closed her eyes briefly. Yes. Daniel watched her, something unreadable passing through his expression. "You're sure he asked after she hung up?" Ruth nodded. "I've lived my whole life making myself small. I'm not doing that again." They drove downtown as the city moved around them in a strange, reverent hush. Sirens in the distance. Traffic slowing for no visible reason. The federal building loomed ahead, all glass and stone, reflecting a version of the city that looked cleaner than it was. Inside, the air was cool and sharp. Purpose lived here. They led Ruth into a conference room. Long table, water pitchers untouched, flags standing quietly in the corners. An assistant U.S. attorney entered, followed by two others. Polite, focused. "Mrs. Caldwell, the lead attorney, said we appreciate your courage." Ruth straightened. "I didn't feel brave." The attorney nodded. "Most people don't." They asked her to tell the story from the beginning. The payments, the threats, the inspections that never quite happened but always loomed. Ruth spoke steadily. She didn't embellish. She didn't dramatize. She didn't need to. Halfway through, one of the attorneys glanced at Daniel. "Mr. Harper, we may need your input." Daniel nodded. Of course. Ruth noticed the way they deferred to him without thinking, the way they waited when he spoke. She filed it away, another piece of a puzzle she hadn't yet seen whole. When it was over, the lead attorney leaned back. "This will help more than you know." Ruth asked the question that had been pressing on her all day. "How many others?" The attorney exchanged a look with his colleague. "Enough." Outside, the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the plaza. Daniel walked Ruth to the steps. "He'll plead," Daniel said quietly. "Not today, but soon." Ruth nodded. He always liked shortcuts. They stood there for a moment, watching people move in and out of the building, lives intersecting without touching. Daniel, Ruth said finally, "You still haven't told me everything." Daniel didn't deny it. "There's one more step." "What kind?" Ruth asked. "The kind where power stops hiding," he replied. She studied him. "You're not just an investigator." "No," Daniel said. "And you're not here by accident." "No." Ruth felt a strange calm settle over her. Then whatever comes next, don't protect me from it. Daniel met her gaze, something like respect flashing through his eyes. I wouldn't dare. That night, as Ruth lay in bed, the city humming softly outside her boarded window, she thought of all the years she had spent invisible. Frank Doyle had tried to erase her. Instead, he had dragged her into the light. And somewhere beyond the noise, beyond the cameras, beyond the courtroom that waited, something larger was moving into position. Tomorrow, Ruth sensed the story would stop being about survival. Tomorrow, it would become about reckoning. The courtroom was quieter than Ruth expected. Not the dramatic silence of movies, but a working quiet. The sound of people who knew the weight of what was about to happen and didn't need to announce it. Papers rustled. Shoes shifted on polished floors. Somewhere an air vent hummed steadily, indifferent to justice. Ruth sat in the second row, hands folded in her lap, wearing the same dark coat she had owned for years. It had been cleaned, pressed, still unmistakably hers. She hadn't bought anything new for today. She didn't need armor. She had memory. Frank Doyle sat at the defense table. He looked smaller than she remembered. Not physically, but diminished, like a man whose reflection had finally caught up to him. His suit was expensive, his hair neat, his posture controlled, but his eyes kept darting, searching for leverage that no longer existed. When he glanced back and saw Ruth, something flickered across his face. Not remorse, calculation. Even now. The judge entered. Everyone rose. Everyone sat. The prosecutor spoke first. Calm, precise, no theatrics, just facts laid end to end like stones you couldn't step around without noticing the path they formed. Payments traced, threats recorded, testimonies corroborated. A system built on fear and silence, finally mapped in daylight. When Frank's attorney stood, his voice lacked conviction. Mitigating circumstances, misunderstandings, a man who had served his community. Ruth almost smiled at the phrase, served, as if extortion were a public utility. Then the judge asked if any victims wished to speak. Ruth hadn't planned to stand. She felt it in her body before her mind agreed. Her hands unfolded. Her feet moved. The room seemed to tilt as she rose, every joint reminding her of her years, every breath grounding her in the present. She walked to the podium slowly. Not because she was weak, but because she was done rushing for anyone. When she turned, she did not look at Frank. She looked at the judge, at the room, at the rows of strangers who would never fully understand what it cost to live quietly under threat. "My name is Ruth Caldwell," she said. Her voice was steady. It surprised her every time. "I sold soup on a sidewalk for almost 20 years. She paused. "Let the ordinariness land. I paid because I was afraid, not of the law, of what happened when the law was used like a weapon by people who knew where the blind spots were." She felt heat rise behind her eyes but didn't stop. "I was told I was lucky to be left alone, that I should be grateful." She inhaled slowly. "Fear makes you small. Silence makes you disappear." The courtroom was still. "I am not here for revenge," Ruth continued. "I am here because there are people like me everywhere, older, tired, doing honest work and being punished for it quietly." She placed her hands flat on the podium. "This ends when the truth stops being treated like trouble." She stepped back. The judge thanked her. The words felt inadequate, but they were sincere. Frank didn't look at her when the sentence was read. Years. Not symbolic. Real. Consequences that could not be negotiated away with favors or phone calls. When the gavel came down, the sound was sharp and final. Ruth didn't cry. She felt something deeper than relief. She felt unburdened. Outside the courthouse, the city waited. Reporters clustered, eager, respectful now. Ruth declined interviews with a small shake of her head. She had said what she needed to say where it mattered. Daniel walked beside her silent. They reached the steps. Sunlight spilled across the plaza, warm and ordinary. "It's done," Ruth said. Daniel nodded. "The first part." She looked at him. "You're not finished." "No," he agreed. "But you are." They stood there a moment longer. Then Ruth laughed softly, the sound surprising them both. What Daniel asked. I was so afraid of losing everything she said. Turns out I was just carrying too much. Weeks passed. The plywood came off Ruth's window. The glass was replaced. Clear, strong. The crack in the wall stayed. She liked it that way. A reminder. Her cart returned to the sidewalk with a new permit, laminated official boring. Exactly how it should be. People came back. Old customers, new ones, some paid, some tried to tip too much. Ruth refused the excess with a firm shake of her head. Dignity mattered. Mrs. Alvarez still sat nearby most mornings, radio in hand, guarding the block like a sentry with opinions. Daniel visited less often. His work pulled him elsewhere now. Bigger cases, wider nets. But when he did stop by, he always ordered soup, always paid, always listened. One afternoon, Ruth asked him the question she'd been holding. What happens when the attention fades? Daniel considered it. That's when systems try to reset. And people like me, Ruth asked. That's when people like you become inconvenient, he said honestly. Ruth smiled. I've been inconvenient my whole life. He smiled back. The neighborhood changed slowly. A committee formed, a hotline was posted. The word extortion stopped being whispered and started being used accurately. Ruth kept selling soup. Not because she had to, because she chose to. On a quiet evening, as the sun dipped low and the sidewalk cooled, Ruth closed her cart and sat for a moment watching the street breathe. Cars passed. People walked. Life went on. She thought of all the years she had stood here unseen, all the fear that had tried to make her smaller, all the silence that had demanded obedience. She hadn't become powerful overnight. She had simply refused to disappear. If this story moved you, stay with us. Like, subscribe, comment.